A couple of you have mentioned my beard in the comments, and so I want to tell you 3 things I hate about it. Number 1 is when I'm wrestling my young children. So I got one that's like 7 years old and one that's 5 and one's 3, and we're all in the bed tussling, and I've got one locked down with my legs and I'm holding another one on top of me. And then the third one, or the loose child, will jump up there and stick both hands in this beard and pull to the roof. The pain is tremendous. I can't stand it. Another thing is I hate eating pancakes with a beard. As you can imagine, if you ever miss, you're going to spend a whole lot of time in the bathroom just washing the beard, hoping that you get to it all. And then lastly, if you take a nap and you just sleep on it, when you wake up, you have to reshape it. And sometimes it takes like 5 minutes to get that thing to behave. And even after I film some of these videos, I look and I'm like, why wasn't my beard behaving? Well, what I want to bring to you today is the argument for God that I would call the infinite more argument, or the infinite plus argument. You know, when you cast around the term infinity, people like scientists and mathematicians and intellectuals and even religious people, we all cast around the term infinity like it's nobody's business. And we all understand it. It's, infinity means forever. We know what the symbol is. We took the definition, and passed it on our classes in school. No big deal. But do you realize we don't even know if infinity exists? Now, some of you are immediately going to go, well, obviously, we don't know infinity exists. It's a conceptualization. But we act like infinity might be possible. And I think there is a lot to consider here. So, for instance, we consider that infinity might really be possible without proof. Like when you start figuring out the digits on pi and you're like, well, this thing goes on forever. It just keeps going and going on forever. But that's really not proof. And in fact, we will believe in the possibility of infinity without good proof. So, for instance, no matter what your sample size is, it's never going to be large enough to prove that infinity is actual or even possible. But yet we kind of mentally concede to it and take it on the notion of faith that infinity might be possible, that it's maybe even probable at times. Now, where do we get this from? I think that's explainable, because one thing that life around us does present is consistent, reproducible testability. And so on those things that seem to be infinite or seem to yield an infinite concept or an infinite amount of interactions within its vein or its path, whatever you want to call it. When we look at that, it's repeatedly testable. So like we can continue to calculate out these irrational numbers further and further as long as we've got enough computing power. And then somebody comes up with a different machine, we'll, compute it even farther out. It's like, well, we're testing it far enough that we believe that it is infinite. Now, can you imagine here if somebody took the role of an atheist? I'm a skeptical, who was skeptical of infinity. And they were like, well, prove it to me. We're like, well, here's my sample size. And like, that's not enough. Prove it to me. It's not large enough. You're like, well, let me expand the sample size and give you more evidence. Like, no. And you're like, well, every time I test this, it proves to be true. And like, no, it's not large enough to convince me that it is infinite. I think you can see part of the problem there. So where, in fact, do we get the concept of infinity from? If it's not completely observable and we're kind of accepting by faith, where do we grasp it from? And I think it comes from things like music and art. You see, you first get exposed to a few notes, like 3 notes, and you're like, oh, you can play any song in the world with these 3 notes. And then you find out that if you add a 4th note, it gets a little more interesting. And then you're like, oh, I can do scales, and then I can work with volume, and I can work with doing this on a different instrument or multiple instruments. And we find that there seems to be an infinite amount of ways to kind of structure music. The same with art. A lot of paintings look similar, but the artist that is keen and studied can make his look unique from the rest and seems to be able to continually do that. Well, as we go on, and this is a weaker argument, but like our personal experiences continue to yield that there's always new things that are happening. And so then it might be easy to surmise that there are always going to be new things happening. Or what about dance moves? You might say there's not an infinite number of dance moves. You'd probably say there's a finite number of dance moves. But would you say there's a finite number of dances? That doesn't seem to be plausible when you start extrapolating the calculations, especially if you give the dance a little bit of a time. What about inventions or conversations or sports ideas, or how many chess games can you play, and how many chemical variations are there in chemistry? All of these things seem to portray with consistent frequency, the more we test it, that there is more to it and that these things can go on indefinitely. We even see this with philosophy. We never quite get to the bottom of the things that we philosophize about. There always seems to be another layer to jump into. Or what about knowledge? There always seems to be a little more to learn, or time seems to continue indefinitely, and it continues to expand. And what about size? You drill down as small as you can get, and then we find smaller. And then as we look out into the universe, it seems to continue to evade our grasp and continues to be further out than we thought. So with all of these things, you begin to gather the concept of infinity. And I think this is one of the reasons why we so readily accept it. Like as a young child, when you're excelling through math and you go through math, and I don't know what grade it's introduced at, but you learn about the infinity symbol and like, oh, what is infinity? Infinity means goes on forever. And it doesn't take much at all to teach this to a child. Now, we might not typically want to accept it, but a lot of people are just like, oh, that's what you mean. I understand what you're saying. Sure, infinity. And then again, as we get older, we talk about these things as if it's in the realm of the theoretically possible, even though it's not provable. And I know some of us might balk at that and go, no, but as we test things, there seems to be infinite variations, and again, infinite size and infinite thoughts, infinite space, infinite time. And so tracking this down, the more we investigate these things, the more we find, and it's utterly fascinating to us. And within that, does nature around us really say anything about infinity? Not really. It's our engagement with nature that reveals the infinity of nature. And so at that point, there's two things. Like number one, this newness, things that are new to us, always seem to have like a little bit of fascination to them and some amazement, and it's exciting and stimulating. And I think here that mankind really gets caught up in looking at the creation that is infinite in its structure. And what they don't realize is that infinity is pretty metaphorical. It's amazing to me. People will watch movies and not really catch the metaphor of the movie. You know, they watch this superhero movie and like, oh, do you know all that was a metaphor for justice? And they're like, huh? I didn't catch that. Or that movie, there was a metaphor about politics. And you're like, really? And so in life, it's funny. Again, nature doesn't say anything per se, but as we investigate it and find this repeating consistently testable pattern of expansion and more, and always the next thing, the plus factor. As we investigate all that, it seems to suggest that there always will be more. As we test, that's what we always find. And if there's always something behind the something, behind the something, behind the something, you wonder if there's not a someone behind all of the somethings, or if you just want to call God a something, just to keep with the thought process here. So that's what we find, is there's always something behind the something. Why not a great something behind all somethings? But here I think most atheists get caught focusing on what is right in front of them instead of thinking about the something behind everything. They look at what is up close instead of the backdrop. And they are so fascinated with the infinity in front of them that they don't think about the infinity behind everything. And you can see this in their emotional zeal. And I'm going to phrase it like this. The Bible says that men worship the creation rather than the creator. And this surely seems to be what's happening with a lot of atheists. They're so excited about the next mathematical equation, or the next quasar discovery, or the next quark as it was isolated and sent backwards in time, and etc. They get so fascinated with the information that the white coats bring them that their praise and adoration goes towards the creation. And of course, the white coats don't mind bringing that out, because if they present to you some unknown facet of creation and they present it, then they receive a lot of the praise and adoration, either directly or indirectly, from those around them. And maybe we haven't noticed it, but they have become the priest of those who worship the material universe. So actually what you have is those that have traded in one God for another God.